Shall we get started, Eric? Are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready when you are.
Alrighty. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the UDNC online, the Expo, the Professional Development Conference, whatever you want to refer to this as. This personally is my 9th conferencing platform of remote learning season. And we're excited to share our presentation today, Protecting Water Resources, and how to think about the upcoming topic. We'll give you 2 cents of who we are. Mr. Clarke.
Hi, everyone. My name's Eric. I'm currently an intern for the Washington Urban Debate League and an alumni of the program, excuse me. I'm also a sophomore at Georgetown University studying international politics.
And I'm David Trigaux, the director of the Washington Urban Debate League. I got really passionate about water policy during a project in graduate school where we had to, it's kind of like debate except without the clash. But we had to create a great presentation on some water policy options. And I hope that we can share our enthusiasm for this year's topic with you, as well as explain some thoughts about how to think about it. Here's our agenda for today. Mr. Clarke is going to go over some of the key laws and policies that have occurred over the last century in terms of water policy. I'm going to talk about the resolution and what all these words mean. We're going to go over some of the big issues and questions, topic areas the students and coaches will need to know about. That's really colorful. And then we're going to talk about some of the core generics you'll hear on the affirmative and the negative, help you start brainstorming those actual arguments.
All right. So I'll get started talking about federal policy. So background for federal policy. So what are the primary policy or federal pieces of legislation that are going to be important or set the framework or groundwork for this year's topic? Having a bit of tech problems. Give me 1 second.
You're still loud and clear for me, Eric, if that helps at all.
There we go. Okay, perfect. So with the upcoming season's topic revolving around water protection in the U.S., there are going to be 2 pivotal policies that act as sort of foundations for this year's topic, as I just said. Not only are these topics important, or policies, excuse me, important for establishing water quality standards and regulating enforcement of policy, but they're also going to be important. For understanding the shortcomings and failures of the current state of water protection in the United States. So the first policy that we're going to talk about is the Clean Water Act, or the CWA. This act is important because it establishes the nation's water quality standards. The CWA is designed to protect the integrity of the nation's water and safeguard marine life, which requires states and tribes to protect bodies of water and uphold water quality standards. And we'll get to who sets those water quality standards that tribal governments and states have to meet later. Additionally, water quality standards should, wherever attainable, provide water quality that's suitable for a plethora of reasons, such as the propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, recreation in or on the water, agriculture, industry, and other purposes, including navigation. And on to the Safe Drinking Water Act, or the SDWA. This is the act that revolves around enforcement. So the CWA is going to be what establishes your quality standards, but the SDWA is going to be, it's going to go over and stipulate how these things need to be enforced. And the primary thing to note about the SDWA is that it stipulates that the states answer to the EPA when it comes to meeting federally established regulations. And additionally, enforcement under the SDWA is contingent upon the states actively pursuing measures targeted at meeting standards set by the EPA. So while it is constitutional for the EPA to set these standards about what the states need to be doing, how much lead is allowed in the water, how much fluoride is allowed in the water, etc. While it is okay for the federal government to do that via the EPA, it is up to the states and tribal governments currently to figure out how to meet those standards on their own. And then going into the background of water protection policy. So this is going to be primarily a conversation about inherency. So what's happening now? Specifically, we'll look at the status of water protection policy in the US as it relates to federal and local efforts. During our conversation about federal efforts, we're going to focus on the EPA during the Trump administration, and we're going to focus on the flip side, local efforts. Those local efforts are going to revolve on what are the courts doing, what are state governments doing, what are tribal governments doing, etc. And just to give you a bit of, a preview into what we'll talk about, the Trump era, the EPA under the Trump administration was not great. It was marked by rollbacks and just oversight. Biden is making progress, but things could be better. And then at the local level is especially interesting because it's a mixed bag when it comes to what responses have been looking like, and we'll get to that in a bit. So starting with Trump's presidency signified overall a weakening of environmental protections and federal water regulation. One example is the sweeping relaxation of environmental laws and fines. Community water systems serving upwards of 77 million people in the US were found in violation of EPA regulations. And for 27 million of those people mentioned, the water provided by the community water system violated the Safe Drinking Water Act's health provisions. These all demonstrate, again, this example demonstrates an overall failure to meet water regulation standards under the Trump administration, again, due to a lack of oversight and due to a lack of enforcement. Some other failures to note, past EPA audits have found widespread underreporting of violations. So the problem could be much more severe than we know because of the underreporting. And additionally, known violations weren't corrected, with action only being taken against 13.1% of offenders. In 2015, only 3.3% of offenders actually received penalties. And then moving on to developments under the Biden administration. Concerning Biden, the overall approach has been to improve environmental protections. Biden has begun to roll back on some Trump-era oversights, like targeting pollution and investing in water infrastructure. Additionally, specific Trump-era measures that Biden has targeted include reform to what the EPA signifies as pollutants, delays in water pollutant requirements, weakened rules on toxic waste dumping from power plants into waterways, and a provision of the CWA that was aimed at weakening the power of states and tribes to object federal project proposals. So for example, on the topic of weakening a provision of the CWA, recently, or under the Trump administration, there was a pipeline project that many states and tribal governments opposed, but due to Trump's weakening of that provision, the tribal governments and state governments and local governments had much less power to fight back against it. And while Biden has been, active, there's still a good amount he needs to get done, and developments in his water protection policy should be watched closely as the year plays out, especially given that we're only a fraction of the way into his presidency, and there could be many more developments. And then on to the local level. So as I stated earlier, there are 4 parts. So state innovations, failures, court influence, and activity of tribal governments. State innovations, developments by states have come in many different forms, ranging from development of new technology to implementing taxes, all aimed at sort of curbing harms against water security and water protection. Some particular areas of note when it comes to innovation and water protection are improving infrastructure, recycling water, improving water monitoring techniques, reducing water impacts from energy production, and improving the quality of water resources writ large. And I'll go over a few examples just to help give you an idea of what's being done at the local level or what can be done at the local level to improve water protection policy in the US. So for example, Philadelphia and Syracuse are pursuing stormwater management measures by implementing green infrastructure that can capture and reuse stormwater. Big Springs and Wichita Falls, Texas, were the first to build potable reuse facilities that allows for wastewater to be treated and reused as drinking water. And finally, Cleveland Metro Parks uses monitoring capabilities to monitor streams affected by runoff in real time and actively monitor the health of streams. And then finally, some governments, some local governments, have worked on redesigning toilets to capture and process waste without the use of water, sewers or electrical connection, again, to make the use of water much more efficient and less wasteful. On to state failures. Again, this is why the states are interesting. Some states, some local jurisdictions are making strides when it comes to progress, some not so much. But the reasons for failure are mixed. So first and foremost, some states simply lack the motivation. So as stated earlier, there's underreporting, and under the Trump administration, it's been clear that the EPA hasn't taken very clear steps to reprimand violators. As a result, people, or not people, but jurisdictions, I should say, states and jurisdictions are not doing the work necessary to meet EPA set standards. States and local governments are not doing the work to abide by the standards set at the federal level because they don't fear sanctions. There is no legitimate, under the Trump administration, there was no legitimate threat of sanctions. And as a result, states got complacent. And when it comes to, deciding whether or not we should invest in water infrastructure or invest in this, new, factory for energy or production of whatever, usually investment in industry took priority over environmental protections. However, another reason that states are failing is because of a lack of federal support and a lack of resources. So some governments, this is particularly true in the case of tribal governments, which we'll get to later, simply do not have the resources, to meet the standards being set by the EPA. To meet some standards, some jurisdictions have to invest in new water infrastructure, invest in technology, etc. That takes money. And again, some jurisdictions, some states, some governments simply do not have the funds to meet EPA set standards. On to court influence. The courts are going to be interesting, or the courts are interesting, I should say, in the sense that the courts have typically act as, a second wall of defense, a second line of defense, where the EPA has failed to hold local governments and state governments to task. The court has usually proved useful. And, the court has typically proved useful in holding states to task and forcing them to actually come into compliance with various environmental protections once, a grievance or an issue has been raised. Let's see, Rachel. Is there an article that explicitly proclaims that absent federal government oversight, states are complacent? What do you, excuse me, could you, I'm not sure what you mean. Absent. I'll come back to that in a second.
Rachel, from my initial research, there are dozens of articles that make that claim. There are a lot of states, as Eric said, the states are pursuing divergent policies. So you're not going to you may not find one that indicts literally every state, but you'll see a lot of folks that without some federal government looking over their shoulder, let environmental protection slip.
Yep, definitely. And to add to what David said, there is also some literature that says, I don't know how prevalent the literature is, but it does mention that, and we'll get to this a bit later when we talk about the focus areas, but it mentions that some states may even need to be incentivized to follow on to federally set standards, and absent those standards, they may be complacent, as mentioned in your question. And then finally, on to tribal governments. The central idea that's at work when it comes to what tribal governments are doing is that There's a lot of federal oversight which hinders their ability to pursue effective water policy protection without any fiscal support. Legal and policy barriers make efficient water infrastructure policy challenging. So, for example, the Indian Non-Intercourse Act prohibits tribes from leasing water without congressional approval. And it's legal frameworks like this that make it difficult for tribal governments to have agency over their affairs when it comes to pursuing water protection policy or water policy that may be important to them. But we'll get more into that a bit later.
So now this is the part of introducing a topic where I would normally tell my students to scour the classroom for dictionaries, and they'd give me blank stares, wondering why they needed to deal with physical books anymore. And I appreciate Eric for actually having been one of those kids who knew where the dictionary was in his class back in the day. I've tried to prepare an adult version, trying to walk through some of the key terms here, also adding some fun pictures. We've broken down the topic into the four main terms that will kind of create the guardrails and shape what this topic is going to look like. Protection, water resources, the questions of geography about what is the United States, and all the other lovely words that seem to find their way into most resolutions, such as substantial, its, increase, all that good stuff. In terms of protection, you're going to find a wide range of definitions on this. And before I jump in, I want to preface this by saying that I represent DC on the NFHS topic wording committee. And I'll take a side note to say that if you aren't already, I can't emphasize how much you need to get involved in this process at your state. Good topics are the linchpin of good debates every year. Many states don't have a very robust process and don't have a lot of people who are involved or actually vote. But getting off my soapbox here, this topic was initially presented as a water quality and used the term conservation, which was intriguing, but the committee thought it was very narrow. So we made a few changes to broaden it, using the term protection instead of conservation as the first effort to do so. I think the definitions of protection fall into four main categories. We've got your first definition, which is sort of a more hardcore, muscular sense of protection. When it, what does this manifest as? We're talking about cases that talk about deploying soldiers or military assets to defend dams, using the 1033 program to better arm fish and wildlife to go after eco-terrorists or corporate polluters. We've got hardening of physical infrastructure, protecting dams, harbors, adding seawalls, because, natural disasters are also something that we need to protect against. In this space, I want to touch briefly on the proliferation of critical infrastructure laws that have been increasingly common. If you're not familiar, these are laws that add extra criminal penalties to attempts to obstruct certain resources such as pipelines and dams. It's usually a counter-protester policy that was instituted after some of the pipeline protests in the Midwest over the last decade. This definition, this interpretation also probably includes cybersecurity questions. And I'll give a recent example. Some of you may have heard that there was a cyber attack on a very depressing suburb of Tampa during the Super Bowl this year. The suburb is called Oldsmar, and where the water officials there, they normally put 100 parts per million of a chemical called lye in the water to keep it clean, which is a normal thing that they do in most places. Somebody hacked their system and tried to add a few zeros, tried to put 10,000 parts per million of lye into the water system. Thankfully, it was caught very quickly. And, the local sheriff said, "I'm not a chemist, but when you put that amount of a chemical into the drinking water, it's not a good thing." I think he's understating a little bit. So we're definitely going to have some cybersecurity cases with seen through the lens of a more muscular definition of protection. We also have folks talking about protection as conservation, which basically means that the topic committee spent a bunch of time changing the wording and didn't change the debates we're going to have at all. But there's no consensus on this sort of protection as conservation definition. Does it mean, or does it include sustainable exploitation? Does it mean, returning to pristine wilderness, or even a de-development angle? These are debates that are going to be had on this topic, both in terms of topicality and in terms of its spillover effects on the substantive parts of the debate. The third piece I wanted to bring up under protection was questions about laws versus behavior. We often think about, can we regulate or legislate, can we have a court decision or whatever to institute a protection? But I think that some cases could attempt to engage in a behavioral intervention instead of a regulatory question. A nudge or an incentive to do something that is less harmful to a water resource instead of an outright ban. And I don't know if that qualifies as protection or not. And the literature is just not very clear about whether it's about means or results in terms of the actual act of protecting. And last but not least, we'll see lots of topicality debates talking about the subject of protection. Are we protecting the water itself from additives like pollution, chemicals, things like that? Or are we protecting a broader array of water-related resources, infrastructure, dams, pipes, harbors, coastlines, you name it? So that will be a fascinating debate as we go forward. In terms of water resources, I wanted to get this little chat to put this little graphic up to help folks understand all of the different water that's really out there. You've got your permanent bodies like lakes, oceans, reservoirs, coasts, oceans, gulfs, and then you have moving bodies, rivers, creeks, streams, brooks, and other fun synonyms for the same. As Eric mentioned, President Obama added some regulatory framework for water resources. And one of the big things that he did was make sure that existing EPA laws covered temporary bodies of water, such as locks, wetlands, water bodies created by snowmelt, and other kind of seasonal or temporary options. In terms of water resources, we also need to think about agricultural use and industrial use, water that's been removed from natural spaces, wastewater, industrial byproducts, water in your tap waiting for you to turn it on. And also in terms of aquifers, groundwater, rain, and other water that's kind of part of an ecological cycle, not currently in a body of water as well. When Dara, Eric, and I were brainstorming this, my first instinct, and if any of you were around coaching or debating on the oceans topic, and this does start to date me a little bit here, is to think about the exclusive economic zone when it comes to thinking about the definition of in the United States. Well, U.S. waters can extend out a certain distance from the shore, and this map can show you a little bit about what we're talking about. This means, cases like creating marine reserves, regulating aquaculture, things that happen on the coastlines, definitely part of the topic. But I think that it's important to also think about this through a bit more of a 360-degree lens. Instead of just the Earth going east and west, we also have water that is under the ground, aquifers, groundwater, etc. That's still within the United States. But we also need to think up into the air. The United States airspace extends to the near-Earth orbit. So things like clouds, rain, snow, we will definitely see some folks attempting to do some geoengineering as a water protection in the United States. Let's look at our other terms here. As usual, we have substantial, and we're not going to quite be able to get away with this one. We might be talking about number of people impacted, gallons of water affected. There's no bright line here, and as usual, the term is there to protect us from very localized or small, sketchy affirmatives. But unlike perhaps the arms sales topic, where there was some sort of a bright line, we're not going to get one on this topic. We might see a few folks talking about the word "it's," and I think the main question we'll see is, are we regulating federal land versus privately held land? And I think a much more general definition will prevail on those arguments. And last but not least, we'll have old favorite comeback. T increase from means using existing program, and increase being different from the word start, which would suggest the creation of new programs. I don't know where we will come down on that. I suspect it will be a robust debate through the year because there are, as my colleague mentioned, a number of existing provisions that can be modified. So there's rich literature about the status quo before creating existing protections. Let's take a quick break, stretch, ask some questions, take extra bite of your brunch. Let's probably cut this down to 2 or 3 minutes since we got a late start, but please encourage everyone to stretch their legs and at least take a vague look away from your screens for a moment. Alan, I see your comment in the chat here. I had a team that was in elimination rounds at, I think, 4 or 5 TOC tournaments that year. And they ran T-substantial against the Saudi Arabia affirmative. And were surprised when they lost. So I hear you on that one. I see your comment in the chat here, Rachel. There might be debate coaches writing articles about substantial inclusion in resolutions. The value of a coach writing a thought piece in a T debate is up for grabs. In terms of the literature about water policy, I at least have not found any substantial question, a definition of substantial that is in a context of water. I think that the literature generally is moving towards a more embraces a wider range of water resources being worth regulation after the Obama era expansion of policy to temporary water sources. Mr. Clarke, are you ready to get back into it?
Yep, I'm ready.
Sounds good.
Oops, back a step. All right, now we'll get into conversations about what the AF may look like. So here are these two slides are going to essentially talk about the different topics we'll be discussing with your students this year, what those topics include, and then we'll talk about how each of those topics translates into arguments. Starting with pollutants and contaminants. This is, and you'll notice pollutants and contaminants, drinking water, why aren't they the same? We'll get into that a bit later. But one of the primary problems with water resources in the SWO is the presence of contaminants and pollutants. An example we can look at to understand why pollutants and contaminants are important is the case of Flint, Michigan, where exceedingly high levels of lead posed a health risk to the community. Some other problems include the acceptance, Some other problems include acceptable levels or overly high levels or exceedingly high levels of pollution and other contaminants coming from factories and industry. Some may have to do with runoff, etc. Anything that negatively impacts, any substances, I should say, that negatively impact the health and quality of the water. Next is going to be infrastructure. So infrastructure is going to be important for a broad range of reasons. Infrastructure can include technology used to purify water resources, identify contaminants, monitor the health of water resources and sources, and much more. Efforts to improve protections for water resources will inevitably include conservations for how we can improve water infrastructure to ensure long-term health of various water resources and sources. The next is going to be security. I think security is going to be a very interesting area for this upcoming topic. Water security is essentially going to center around conversations about essentially the state of security as it relates to our current water infrastructure. So as David mentioned, there was a case this year or recently in which a water treatment plant was, subject to a cyber attack that essentially increased the amount of, or the acceptable amount at that particular plant of lye that was allowed in the water. And as David said, it was caught very quickly, but again, had this not been quickly, it would have been very, very deadly and very, very disastrous for the community. And this is just a sneak peek into what we can see when it comes to the vulnerabilities, how certain people can take advantage of the vulnerabilities of our water infrastructure. And additionally, this debate isn't limited to discussions of cybersecurity. It can also encompass conversations about the physical security of water infrastructure as it relates to physical attacks. On to drinking water. I was thinking about how this section should be labeled because I think this section is going to focus on, are there things we can do with our water? Can we do stuff with that water? But there are so many more purposes and uses for water that I think when we say drinking water or water for whatever purpose, we should think about all of the different ways that it can be used, and we'll get into that a bit later. So this is going to be a conversation, again, as I said, revolving around the question of whether or not the water is usable. In particular, debaters who are, looking to improve the quality of water resources may look at things from the perspective of, is this water usable in industry? Is this water usable in agriculture? Is this water usable in the restoration or the conservation of ecosystems, etc.? So when we talk about is water usable, we need to think about all of these different areas in which water is important. On to economics. Economics relates to water resource protection because, again, as we all know, money is very important when it comes to protecting water resources. And while there are very interesting conversations to be had about like economics on the negative side of things, as it relates to the affirmative, economics and money writ large are important in the sense that some states or the federal government may need to provide financial incentives, or it can provide financial incentives to ensure state follow-on when it comes to, you know, adhering to EPA set standards, which we'll get into on the next slide. Second to last section is going to be rights. So this section, while there are a few rights, I should say, I'll take a step back. While there are a few rights, there are two rights in particular that are going to act as sort of the nexus for the conversations that we have during the upcoming season. So the first has to do with ownership over water resources, and the second has to do with the right to have access to clean water. As we have seen, excuse me, with tribal governments, some localities, some jurisdictions do not have rights. The right to, you know, the right of ownership, I should say, over their water resources. And in the case of many underlooked and marginalized communities across the US, there are plenty of communities that don't have access to clean water, and teams are going to have that conversation about access to clean water being a basic right. And then next, finally, on to climate change. Climate change, again, the conversation here is very straightforward. As climate change gets worse, the quality of water resources, or the quality of water sources in general, deteriorates as a result of pollution. And here's how these things translate into arguments. So starting with pollutants and contaminants, this area is interesting because teams can either focus on specific contaminants or substances, or they can, you know, scale things up to be or to have or adopt a geographic focus. So teams can say, let's focus on the level of lye present in the water, or they can say, let's focus on water pollution on the East Coast. Or they can combine the two and say, let's focus on the problem of lead poisoning in the water as it relates to like the Midwest. So there are a bunch of different things that we can do with that. But ultimately, these are going to be teams that are focusing on like, are there things in the water? How can we get those things out of the water? Where are those things being in the water a problem, etc. And additionally, this area is interesting because there are a plethora of ways that teams will be able to go about addressing issues of water health and quality. So earlier we talked about monitoring systems, and actually, let me take a step back. I'm going to what David mentioned when it comes to how there are sort of different definitions of protection. Some teams can engage in, you know, building infrastructure or constructing infrastructure that's important to the monitoring of a water source's health. And that can be seen as sort of conservation or preventing future, you know, deterioration of the water resource. Some teams can develop infrastructure that is, you know, some teams, excuse me, can add new contaminants to the list. Some teams can develop various regulations to prevent future pollution, excuse me. There are a plethora of things that you can do. And again, it's all because the definition of protection is kind of encompassing. It has a very large scope in my opinion. On to infrastructure. So there's an interesting overlap here between infrastructure and water security. So we'll talk about the two in tandem. Firstly, teams can focus on the need to update the nation's aging water infrastructure against modern cyber threats by strengthening the technology at the foundation of our infrastructure, developing programs or technology to support the infrastructure, etc. Teams can also have conversations about how we physically fortify water infrastructure to protect from external and physical threats. Based on some scans of the literature, I would say that the arguments about water security as it relates to cyber threats is more likely than physical threats, but again, both are definitely possible points of discussion for this upcoming season. And then secondly, teams could also talk about ways to improve current water infrastructure or develop new infrastructure to improve water protection and engage in long-term protection. So for example, as I stated before, you can engage in, you can develop infrastructure that monitors the health of water sources to ensure that there's long-term security, long-term protection. You can develop infrastructure that cuts down on the use of water, etc. There are many ways that you can go about developing new infrastructure to improve protections. On to water security proper. Teams can focus on conversations about how to. There's not much to add here, really. Teams are, when it comes to water security, they're going to focus on establishing, a trend of water security or water infrastructure being a possible target for attacks, whether it be cyber or physical. For example, they may allude to or reference the attack on the Florida water treatment plant. And additionally, I think another argument that's going to come up here is proving that another genre of argument I'll say is going to be proving that the water grid has long been neglected or overlooked, specifically the security of the water grid. And instead of focusing on the water grid, people have been overly invested in protecting and fortifying the power grid. And as a result of that overinvestment in the power grid or other US infrastructure, the water grid is especially vulnerable right now in the status quo. And so conversations about different US objectives when it comes to security are going to be relevant, particularly the power grid. And onto drinking water, almost finished. Onto drinking water, teams can focus their plans on, again, specific regions of the country. They could focus on specific contaminants or substances, etc. But I think what's most important here, or what's most interesting here, is the conversation about the different uses of water. So assessing whether or not this source of water is suitable for the protection of, suitable for use in agriculture, whether or not it's suitable for use in recreation, whether or not it's suitable for use in industry, etc. And the reason it's interesting is because all of those different areas or subtopics, I should say, have different standards. I don't think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the water standards for drinking water are going to be exactly the same as the water that's used for the production of certain commodities. So it's going to be interesting in the sense that there are going to be different things that we can focus on water quality for, or there are going to be different standards that we can hold water quality to, and there are going to be different uses for said water resources. Moving on to economics, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a big problem with not only ensuring that states and local jurisdictions have the resources necessary to meet federal standards, but also there's a lack of motivation on the part of local jurisdictions. So some teams can provide fiscal support to jurisdictions that are failing to meet EPA set standards or regulations, or some affirmatives as part of a larger plan can provide financial incentives to local jurisdictions and states to ensure that there's follow-on. Because again, if we want to operate within the Constitution, if we want things to be constitutional, if we don't want to mandate essentially how states should go about water regulation and violate the SDWA, teams are going to have to come up with a way to not only set standards that are sufficient, but also ensure solvency, also ensure that states are going to carry out these measures, also ensure that states are going to meet the newly declared or newly set water regulation standards. So again, there's a conversation about how we support jurisdictions that are falling behind or can't support themselves. And there's going to be a conversation about how we ensure solvency on the part of the AF and how we can use money to incentivize states to follow on. Next is rights. These are going to be your environmental justice asks. These are going to be your asks that talk about tribal rights and water management. As I alluded to earlier, there's been a problem with, too much federal oversight, but not enough support for tribal governments. So some AFs may, afford or provide tribal governments with more rights or agency over their own water resources that's in their territory and their jurisdiction to ensure more efficient water protection or management, I should say. And then there's also going to be a set of affirmatives that talk about environmental racism and how certain groups have been overlooked historically or consistently when it comes to ensuring that there's sufficient water protection. So again, there's going to be a very large and potent conversation, I should say, about the rights of water as it relates to land ownership and as it relates to environmental racism. And then finally, climate change. This is very straightforward. It's just going to deal with developing solutions for the issue of climate change in order to ensure the long-term health and security of water resources. Again, I see an argument being made that as long as climate change is an issue, the affirmative can never have solvency. So it may be a prerequisite So again, solving for water resources and protection of water resources, in that sense, addressing the problem of climate change may be a prerequisite or a prior question. So there's definitely a conversation to be had about affirmative teams who address the problem of climate change, either as their primary mechanism for protection or as a secondary mechanism to ensure, again, long-term protection and health of water resources.
Now, normally I'd say it's the time for the 2N to talk now, but Eric was double twos most of his career, so can't claim any expertise that he doesn't already have there. For our veteran coaches, I'll run through this slide pretty quick. We know that there are several buckets of negative argumentation that they all generally get lumped into. We have case debate, and this is going to be a good topic for case debate. Lots of sciencey details, a relatively constrained list of mechanisms, a good impact list right for defense and turns. There's going to be lots of good disadvantages, counterplans, critiques, and I've already talked your ear off about topicality a little bit. So let's jump into let's take a deeper dive here. Can you advance this, Eric? So on the coming water topic, we're not going to hear the latest from Robert Kagan, but there still will be some great case debates to be had either way. This is a really good opportunity, and I'll take another moment for a sidebar here, to recruit more STEM-oriented debaters to your teams. They're going to be here for the science and the technology of their cases and to build some communication skills. And we had a lot of success doing this on the oceans topic, so I highly recommend it as a way to help grow programs next year. In terms of impacts, we have a narrower range than we have with CJR, and we have a lot of overlooked, less discussed impacts than our usual econ collapse, hegemony conversations. There's going to be lots of good impact framing, lots of questions about offense and defense on different impacts, and a lot of them are just asking for some creative turns. The last thing I'll say on the case is that this nexus of energy, food, the environment, and economics is a beautiful, complex, interrelated question that will have so many good arguments. Most interventions, most tweaks to the system will only produce partial benefits and will have side effects to complain about. And because so many of the cases this coming year are going to touch on this nexus, there are some good generic case turns that you can build a strategy around against most affirmative cases. This isn't simply a case of having really good generics against one case. A lot of these are going to be cross-applicable. In terms of the disadvantage, we've got some really great options here. I saw a question in the chat earlier about will President Biden's infrastructure plan include water elements? And the answer is probably. The guts of the bill are still up for debate. But I will say that this is going to be a very good scenario, potentially the best debate since SCIFTA, if anyone remembers those. Again, my gray hair is starting to show a little here. We're also going to have some strong 2022 scenarios with a divided Senate and a lot of cases that will disproportionately impact certain geographies where there are contested Senate seats up for grabs. Urban areas such as Georgia, where the majority of the votes are coming out of Atlanta. Got lots of drought-prone desert areas like Arizona, where we have Senator Kelly up for election. And we've got some coastal areas and some mountains like North Carolina, where we might have we have an open seat that might feature Laura Trump. Other strong generics, we've got federalism, spending, trade-off disads, agency credibility. I mean, we're going to be hearing a lot about Buttigieg and Deb Haaland. Swampbuster is going to be a good option for both the affirmative and the negative. For those who are not familiar, this is a federal wetlands program that mandates that farmers let some of their land stay undeveloped and essentially protected. if you would agree to accept government agricultural subsidies. Well, surprise. I hope you didn't think that was the sum of the disads we're in for this year, despite what a lot of the grumpy memers on social media have been talking about. There are a ton of really good arguments beyond the generics that we rely on every single year. The best way to think about it is that every intervention on this topic is going to impact water in at least one of three ways, often unintentionally or indirectly, but they'll still have these consequences. It'll change the price, it'll change the quantity, or it'll implement substantial new burdens on government. And for those disads, go back to my previous slide here. But when we talk about changing the price and quantity of water, there are tons of negative consequences. There are lots of industry disads, broader arguments about the impact of regulation on the economy as a whole, arguments about insurance. I would need a whole nother session to go over all of the subcategories of disads about the economy here. And to head off some of y'all's concerns, yes, a lot of these will be competitive with soft left affirmatives about sick kids getting lead poisoning. As I mentioned earlier on the case slide, we have this nexus of agriculture, energy, the environment, the economy, trade, commodities. There's going to be a ton of trade-offs, a ton of secondary implications of almost every case coming out of this nexus. You just got to think a little creatively about the downstream effects of the affirmative. In terms of circumvention, there's going to be a ton of different options here. My favorite of which is the pollution exportation disad. For those interested in researching that, the term you're going to want to Google is the pollution haven hypothesis. About sort of countries being willing to accept pollution as an import in exchange for relative economic benefit. And as we were talking about in the chat with Coach Bruce here, we have some international relations disads. This, the environment, water does not stop at national borders. And this is the first season I can remember that U.S.-Mexico relations are actually on the brink instead of just a contrived brink in my entire debate career. And that's before we think about nations' economies and the impact on their environments that are a little further away from us. Coach Bruce, that was the pollution haven hypothesis. In terms of topicality, I'm going to run through this real fast since we've covered most of it already. We're totally going to see people say humans are 70% water, so anything that protects humans is topical. Whether we should vote for those people is a different question. I think we're going to see a lot of people running T protection. I think we're going to see some folks talking about water resources. This is a term of art as a subset of natural resources. We have a congressional committee on natural resources, and one of their subcommittees. This is a term of art that a lot of government sources are using, but I think you'll have some sneaky kids talking about what form. So we're talking about snow, clouds, rain, virtual water, salt water, bottled water, you name it. And I think lastly, we're going to see a lot of effects arguments. We've already heard some camps from the national circuit talking about, their bigger stick affirmatives that want to solve impacts like global warming that don't actually have any water-related impacts. And one of the fun little tricks that I've put together is that if an affirmative doesn't have a water-related impact, and they concede that question, whether in cross-X or because you run a case card against them in the 1C or something, you should dump topicality on them in the block. Because if the affirmative team concedes that they're not stopping harm to a water resource, they're not actually topical. In terms of counter plans, this is going to be a good debate. area, like most domestic topics, I've broken these into 6 categories. In terms of process counter plans, we've got your unique to this topic area, things like the EIS or EA, which are evaluations that the EPA does for major construction projects to make sure they are going to be environmentally sustainable. We also have a lot of generics, RegNeg, commissions, CONCON, the NGA. I saw somebody was running a referendum counter plan yesterday. Nobody's losing any of their fund back files. In terms of the actor counter plans, we've got a lot of the usual friends like states, courts, and stuff like that. We also have some more unique options. From the last infrastructure topic, the negative infrastructure bank as a funding mechanism was very popular and should see a renaissance on this topic. I'd also like to share a recommendation from a friend of mine who works at the Center for American Progress on water policy and is also a former debater from Long Beach. Her gut instinct at first response to this topic was changing how we manage and break down the oversight of water instead of governing it by state lines, municipal lines, all that sort of stuff, which is very artificial and man-made since water doesn't stop at the city limit. Her recommendation was to go and create management of water through the entire watershed or the basin, which is a much more integrated approach that can have better outcomes. Advantage counter plans are making a comeback, and this is going to be a topic to continue that process. There are going to be lots of interesting affirmative mechanisms, but few of them will have a unique ability to solve the affirmative. So there'll be lots of options for the negative to offer counter proposals as well. In terms of funding picks, we're going to see some privatization counter plans and hopefully quickly pivot to the better methods of privatization, your incentives, loan guarantees, bonds, prizes, all that good stuff. We're going to see the rich guy funds the plan, counter plan, Bezos, Elon Musk, pick your billionaire. And we're going to see some international actor counter plans, China, United Nations, maybe others. A lot of sovereign wealth funds and other international investors are looking for infrastructure-based investments because they are safe, longer-term places to get a guaranteed return on investment instead of a more risky dive into a stock market or something like that. Surprisingly good literature there. In our, conditions and consulting, the counter plans that generate theory debates on their own, we will see a lot of, consult the indigenous tribes and other groups like that. I think we will see some conditioning arguments about, guaranteeing protection if a certain economic outcome occurs. And I think the most interesting area here, especially for our friends out west, is using the interstate compact mechanism to arrive at some sort of a agreement through a relatively obscure process there. And last but not least, Allie was telling me, and as Eric shared in our first few slides, environmental protection, especially in water, it's not new. We have lots of laws already on the books here, and somehow we keep having pollution and crimes committed in this area. So a counter plan to actually enforce some of our existing laws could definitely be competitive and useful. Last but not least, I want to touch on the critique, and I'll emphasize that all of these schools of thought are available to both sides of the debate, the affirmative and the negative, and there's really a wide range of thought here. And I'll kind of break it down into some buckets. We have economic arguments. We often approach the natural world as a resource. So traditional arguments about anti-capitalism, semio-cap, critiques of consumption like Bataille, critiques of competitiveness, any anti-capitalist literature is going to be in play on almost every affirmative here. Next, we have a lot of arguments about the use of the state and the use of technology. The arguments about managerialism are surprisingly good, especially once you get beyond Heidegger and Nucleolus. We have traditional biopolitical arguments and some green biopolitical authors talking about the intervention of the state over the environment instead of the state over people. We have security questions, especially the expansion of the security apparatus into non-traditional zones of, trying to secure everything, not just against militaries and such. We'll also have lots of critiques of location, the borders critiques of geography and location. Those are going to be huge and definitely make a comeback on this year's topic. Next, one of the biggest areas of literature that have been read on a lot of topics lately have been about critiques of identity and justice. The settlerism argument set call is probably going to be the biggest critique on this topic, hands down, because it's all about the use of the land. I think there will still be space for arguments about pessimism and futurism and other options in that department. And I think you'll see a resurgence of gender-related critiques as well. The bad version talk about how women have a special relationship to nature, but there are a lot of really good arguments that go a little deeper into that relationship there. And last but not least, I want to talk about the sort of environment-specific literature. And this is really one of the net benefits of this topic, is we actually get to talk about something new that we don't get to talk about on a lot of other topics. I will emphasize that I'm just scratching the surface here. There are a lot of critiques of, ontological critiques of our relationship to nature. There is the deep ecology literature. There is a lot of literature that talks about how we talk about the environment impacts the way people perceive and react to policy questions there. There's phenomenological critiques, externalization, sort of how we approach the environment psychologically, and our old friend, anthropocentrism.
David, before you go on, this is Bruce. Wanted to know what hydrontology was?
So hydrontology is not a critique that I've run, but it is basically a critique that says that water should be treated as an ontological, it should have sort of its own, what am I trying to say here? It should be treated as its own entity instead of an entity that we act upon. If that makes any sense. Yeah, I mean, it is a prerequisite to how we make policy in terms of we treat water as a resource. I think the most extreme folks would treat it as an entity that we can, if corporations are people, I think you'll hear somebody say that water should be treated as an entity as well. The hydrontology literature is definitely a rabbit hole to go down. Lastly, I just wanted to share a few final thoughts, and thank you for joining us today. And number one, please work with Sarah Sanchez on core files so that we can not duplicate some labor and get some great options for our students this year. She is having that conversation with league staff during the semifinal round tomorrow, And Eric and I are deep in the weeds of producing the Washington files already. We have a few samples already done, ready to use. Number 2, get your science teachers involved. Get some to be head coaches, get some to be assistant coaches, specifically for this year. Get out of your humanities department and make this topic a way to make new connections across your school. Number 3, I'd say be creative and embrace local questions. Just as Tulsa is advocating to abolish their city's police department in the tournament today, I think that, and Coach Bruce has talked about a lot of Colorado specific things. We've got schools that have, and Boston as well has a lot of schools where you're not supposed to drink the water in the school water fountain. Local or regional cases like this are going to speak to your students a lot because these are things that impact their daily lives, and they're also going to have some great literature about them and be worthy of debate and worthy of learning about. I think that everyone who is interested has put their email in the chat, but if anyone else has joined us, happy to share this presentation, and thank you for listening.